The mirror ritual. There's something inherently unsettling about mirrors. They reflect, but they don't reveal. They're not quite real, but not entirely false either. They exist in that strange in-between space, offering a distorted view of the world we know. But for Evelyn, that in-between space wasn't just a curiosity. It was a gateway, a chance to peer beyond the veil, to face something she had always wondered about, her own doppelganger. Evelyn had always felt as though there was someone else inside her, someone who lived just out of reach, someone who shared her face, her mannerisms, her thoughts, but was never quite the same. There had been times growing up when she would catch glimpses of a figure in the corner of her eye, a reflection that didn't belong. The mirror was a place of comfort and terror, a place where she could examine herself and, at times, lose herself. The idea of meeting her other self wasn't new. It had existed in the back of her mind for years, sparked by stories of ancient rituals passed down through folklore. Some said the mirror was a portal, a reflection of the soul, a doorway to another world. Others spoke of dark rituals, where one could call forth their double, an entity that lived in the mirror, trapped between worlds. Evelyn had heard the tales, half doubtful, half curious, but as time went on, that curiosity turned into obsession. She had to know if her doppelganger existed. The ritual was simple, at least on paper. The instructions were clear. Find a mirror, one that was old and forgotten. The older the better, as it would carry the weight of years and energies long past. Perform the ritual at midnight, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Light candles around the mirror, sit before it, and wait for your reflection to show itself. Wait for it to speak. Evelyn had gathered everything she needed. A small antique mirror she had bought from an estate sale, a few candles, and a match to ignite the dark ritual. She set them up in her living room, the room draped in shadows from the flickering candlelight. Her breath caught as she stared at her reflection for the first time, taking in the stillness of the moment. There was a quiet tension in the air, as if the mirror itself was aware of her presence. The ritual began, and she recited the words she had memorized. Her voice trembled at first, but the more she spoke, the more the room seemed to pulse with energy. The candles flickered wildly, casting strange shadows across the walls. She glanced at the mirror, expecting her reflection to shift, to move in some subtle way, but nothing happened. For a long while she sat there, heart pounding, staring at her reflection. It was just her, normal, still, unchanging. She almost gave up, her hopes deflating, when something caught her eye. A movement. At the edge of the mirror, her reflection. No, it wasn't quite the same. For a split second she saw her reflection twitch. A subtle shift in posture, the tilt of her head, a small, almost imperceptible smirk that didn't belong to her. Her breath hitched, and she leaned in closer, her fingers trembling. "Is that you?" she whispered. The reflection didn't respond, but the smirk lingered. Then, as if satisfied with her gaze, it returned to its original position, mirroring her perfectly. It was her reflection, but it wasn't. The longer she stared, the more she felt a strange unease building in her chest, a feeling she couldn't shake, like something was lurking just beyond the surface, something waiting for her to let down her guard. She waited and waited, but the mirror was still. That night, Evelyn went to bed unsettled, her thoughts racing. Had she really seen something move? Or had it been a trick of the light, a trick of her mind? She couldn't be sure. The whole experience felt too surreal, too heavy to dismiss as mere superstition. But over the next few days, something changed. At first, it was subtle. Tiny things that seemed to happen only in the reflection. Her movements would sometimes lag by a fraction of a second. When she smiled, her reflection would smile a little too wide. She caught it in the bathroom mirror as she brushed her teeth. Her reflection was grinning, a gleam in its eye that didn't match the calm expression on her face. It started to feel like the mirror wasn't just reflecting her anymore. It was studying her, mimicking her. Her reflection no longer seemed to wait for her to move. Instead, it seemed to anticipate her actions, sometimes making its own movements, actions that weren't aligned with hers. It was subtle at first, but as the days passed, it grew harder to ignore. The mirror was becoming more alive, more aware of her presence. Then one night, it happened. Evelyn was sitting alone in her living room, the silence of the house pressing down on her. The ritual had been long forgotten, but the mirror still sat in the corner of the room, its reflection watching her, always watching. She had tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself that it was just a trick of the mind, that the rituals had no power. But tonight, the air in the room was thick, heavy with something otherworldly. She glanced at the mirror, just for a second, and froze. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. It wasn't copying her actions. It was moving on its own. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her reflection in the mirror was staring back at her, but it was different now. It was smiling, wide and slow, an unnatural, chilling grin that stretched too far. Its eyes were dark, gleaming, and somehow they weren't hers anymore. They were alive, filled with something far older, far more sinister. Her heart raced. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "No, no, no." The reflection leaned forward, pressing its hands against the glass of the mirror, and Evelyn felt an icy chill seep into the room. It was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something that had been lying in wait, watching, learning, waiting for the moment when it could take its turn. The whisper came then, low and raspy, a sound that sent chills crawling down Evelyn's spine. "It's my turn now," it hissed, its voice familiar but twisted, like a distorted echo of her own. Evelyn stumbled back, her mind racing. She tried to look away, but the reflection, no, the thing that looked like her, did not let her. It stepped forward again, its form growing more solid, more tangible. The glass of the mirror seemed to ripple like water, the surface warping as if the mirror itself were alive, trying to pull her in. Panic surged through Evelyn as she scrambled for the door, but it slammed shut in her face. She turned back to the mirror. Her reflection stepped out, its grin widening, its form breaking through the glass with sickening ease. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing against Evelyn's face. "You're mine now," it whispered. And as it stepped fully into the room, the lights flickered, plunging everything into darkness. Evelyn was never seen again. Neighbors would say they heard strange noises coming from her apartment, soft, rhythmic tapping at the windows, faint whispers in the air. But when they knocked on her door, there was no answer. All that remained was the mirror, sitting in the corner of the room, reflecting nothing but the stillness of an empty apartment. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon is full, if you stare long enough into a mirror, you might catch a glimpse of something just beyond the glass. A reflection of someone who looks just like you, but isn't. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear the whisper, "It's my turn now." The Whispering Forest. The idea had been simple. Just a weekend trip to get away from it all. No cell phones, no internet, just nature and good company. Ethan had planned the whole thing, convincing his friends that the best way to unwind was to escape to the middle of nowhere, a remote forest where the sky was clear and the world felt untouched. They had all agreed easily enough. There was Sam, his childhood best friend, always up for an adventure. Then there was Olivia, Ethan's girlfriend, who loved hiking and had been the most excited about the trip. Lucas and Rachel rounded out the group, a couple that had been together for years, always teasing each other but inseparable. 5 friends, eager for a break, ready to spend 3 nights camping beneath the stars. The drive was long, winding roads leading them deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew denser, towering sentinels stretching toward the sky, their branches thick enough to block out the sun in some areas. It was beautiful in a way that felt ancient, untouched. By the time they reached the campsite, the afternoon was waning. They parked the car near the base of a hill, where a narrow dirt path led into the woods. It was a place untouched by tourists, known only to those who had grown up in the area. Ethan had found it by accident years ago and had always wanted to return. Setting up camp was easy. They pitched their tents near a clearing where the trees gave way to an open patch of sky. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. They built a fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, and for a while, everything was perfect. They talked, laughed, passed around drinks, and roasted marshmallows. Olivia leaned against Ethan, the warmth of the fire reflecting in her eyes. Lucas and Rachel bickered playfully over the best way to toast a marshmallow, and Sam regaled them with one of his signature ghost stories, voice low and dramatic. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned low, that they heard it. A whisper, soft, barely audible over the crackling embers. Ethan thought at first that he had imagined it, but then Olivia stiffened beside him. "Did you hear that?" Sam smirked. "If this is part of your plan to freak us out, it's working." "No," Olivia said, her voice uneasy. "I swear I heard something." The group fell silent, listening. The night stretched around them, vast and empty. Then, a whisper, faint, drifting through the trees like a breath of wind. Rachel shifted closer to Lucas. "That's kinda creepy." Ethan forced a chuckle. "Probably just the wind. Sound carries weirdly in the woods." But he didn't believe that, because the whisper hadn't been just noise. It had been his name. He stood, brushing off the unease. "Let's call it a night. We've got a long day of hiking tomorrow." One by one, they retreated to their tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. But sleep didn't come easily. Ethan lay awake, staring at the fabric of his tent, listening. And at some point, in the stillness of the night, he heard it again. A whisper, closer. "Ethan." His breath caught. He turned his head, staring at the tent flap. His heart pounded in his chest. It had sounded like Olivia's voice. He swallowed hard and reached out, unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was nearly out, the world cast in darkness. Olivia's tent was zipped shut. Everyone was asleep. Then who had whispered his name? A shiver ran down his spine. He zipped the tent back up and forced his eyes closed, willing himself to sleep. By morning, the night's unease had faded. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and the forest no longer seemed so ominous. They had breakfast, packed supplies, and set off for a hike, winding deeper into the woods. It was beautiful, until Rachel disappeared. One moment, she had been walking ahead with Lucas, teasing him about something. Then the next, she was gone. Lucas spun in place. "Rachel?" Silence. A deeper silence than before. "Rachel?" His voice rose in panic. Ethan's stomach dropped. She couldn't have just vanished. They searched the immediate area, calling her name. The trees stretched endlessly around them, their trunks thick and unmoving. There was no sound, no movement, just stillness. Then, far off in the distance, a whisper. Software teasing. "Rachel." Lucas turned toward the sound, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Ethan grabbed his arm. "It's not her." Lucas shook him off. "We have to find her." And then he ran. "Lucas, wait!" Olivia shouted. But he was already disappearing between the trees. Then, silence. No footsteps. No branches snapping. Nothing. They stood frozen, horror creeping up their spines. Then the whisper returned. Closer. "Rachel." Ethan clenched his fists. "We need to go back to camp." "But," Olivia started, but he cut her off. "Now." They stumbled back, barely holding onto their bearings. When they reached camp, it felt wrong. The fire was out, the tents looking somehow smaller, lonelier. Then they saw the pile. Rachel's backpack, Lucas's jacket, their belongings scattered on the ground like discarded leaves, but no trace of them. A heavy silence settled over the remaining three. Sam ran a shaking hand through his hair. "What the hell is happening?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, but we're leaving." Olivia nodded quickly, her face pale. They packed as fast as they could, shoving gear into their bags. Then the whisper came again, closer. "Ethan." He stiffened. It sounded just behind him. He turned and saw nothing. The air pressed against his skin, thick and suffocating. A terrible, suffocating certainty filled him. They weren't going to make it out. And he was right, because Sam vanished next. One moment, he was beside them, and the next, his bag hit the ground, his body gone. The whispering grew louder. Ethan grabbed Olivia's hand, pulling her toward the path. They ran. Branches tore at them. The whispers surrounded them, a cacophony of voices, laughing, calling, mocking. Then Olivia's hand slipped from his. He turned, breath heaving. She was gone. And then there was only Ethan, alone. The whispers swirled around him. He stumbled back to the campsite, breath ragged. His friends' belongings lay scattered in the dirt, but there was no trace of them. Only whispers, growing closer, growing hungry. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last thing he heard was his own name, spoken in Olivia's voice. Then, silence. The silent patient. When Dr. Claire Donovan first met Evelyn, she thought it would be just another routine session, a new patient with a troubled past seeking guidance. But there was something unsettling about Evelyn from the start. She had the kind of stillness that could fill a room, an unnerving quietness that seemed to stretch beyond her refusal to speak. The woman was not mute. She was simply silent. Claire had encountered patients who struggled to articulate their thoughts, those who found it difficult to open up. But Evelyn's silence was different. It was as though the very act of speaking was too much to bear. Her wide eyes, dark and vacant, spoke volumes, but she never said a word. It was as if something deep inside her prevented her from giving voice to the thoughts that churned beneath her calm exterior. At first, Claire thought it was some form of trauma-induced mutism. She encouraged Evelyn to express herself through writing, but even then, the woman only scribbled fragmented sentences, a stream of broken thoughts that made little sense. There were no clear memories, no recollection of specific events, only a sense of something lurking just beyond the surface, something both ominous and heavy. In the beginning, Claire's frustration with the lack of communication was palpable. She tried everything, from simple prompts to open-ended questions. But Evelyn would only sit there, staring at her, eyes unreadable, until the session ended with no progress. It wasn't unusual for therapy to take time, especially with patients who resisted talking. But Claire had a gut feeling that Evelyn's silence was hiding something much darker than she realized. The first strange occurrence happened a few days after Evelyn's second session. Claire had returned to her home, a small, cozy townhouse she had purchased after her divorce, and was preparing for an evening alone. As she settled into her living room with a book, she heard a faint whisper. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but there was something familiar about it. Claire froze, straining her ears. The whisper seemed to come from the kitchen, but when she got up to check, no one was there. She dismissed it as the house settling, old pipes, creaking wood. It had been a long day, and her mind was likely playing tricks on her. But as the days went on, the whispers returned, always just out of reach, like a half-remembered song that wouldn't quite fade. They became more frequent, always in the background, just beyond her conscious hearing. Claire tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew stronger. It was as if the house itself had become a living thing, murmuring under its breath. She couldn't pinpoint the exact words, but there were feelings embedded in the sounds, hints of fear, of something dangerous. The first time she saw the shadow, she nearly screamed. It was late one night, after a long session with Evelyn, that Claire entered her hallway and saw something move in the corner of her vision. It was a fleeting glimpse, just a shadow passing by. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The sensation lingered, though, a cold, oppressive feeling, like the air had thickened. She tried to push it aside, convincing herself it was just the result of stress. But that night, she slept fitfully, waking repeatedly as a sense of dread washed over her. When the shadows returned, Claire was no longer willing to ignore them. It had been 2 weeks since Evelyn's last visit, and Claire's patience was wearing thin. The whispers in her home were no longer the distant murmurs they had been. They were right there, in her ears, clearer and more insistent. It was as though they were beckoning her, pulling her deeper into something she could barely understand. One evening, after a particularly frustrating session with Evelyn, Claire found herself alone in her office, staring at the patient's file. The silence had become unbearable. Her mind replayed the fragmented sentences Evelyn had written during their sessions, each one more cryptic than the last. She watches, the dark one. It follows. It waits behind the walls. Can you hear it? The silence is a cage. Claire's skin prickled as she read the last line over and over again. The silence wasn't just a symptom. It was part of the problem. Evelyn was trapped in it, and Claire was beginning to realize that her patient's silence was a form of communication. A communication that was growing increasingly more desperate and dangerous. That night, as Claire lay in bed, her mind racing, the whispers came again. But this time, they were clearer, louder. She is the key. You must listen. Claire shot upright, heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. These were real voices, voices that weren't her own. They were coming from the very walls of her home, from the shadows that seemed to stretch out before her. The sense of unease had escalated to pure terror, and she knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary haunting. There was something tied to Evelyn, something sinister that followed the therapist back from the office, whispering through the dark. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could Evelyn be somehow causing these events? Could the silent woman, who sat so still and quiet during each session, have a connection to whatever was happening in her house? Had the therapy been a surface, something evil that had been dormant for years? The next session with Evelyn was the turning point. As Claire sat across from her patient, she felt the tension in the room thickening. The air felt charged, alive with an energy she couldn't understand. She was about to speak when she noticed something. Evelyn's eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on her with an eerie precision. The whispers were louder now, filling Claire's ears, but when she tried to focus on them, they vanished, as if they were never there to begin with. Claire could no longer tell where the whispers ended and her own thoughts began. Her gaze flicked toward Evelyn, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of the woman's silence. Then, without warning, Evelyn's fingers twitched, just once, but it was enough to make Claire's breath catch in her throat. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but in that moment Claire knew. Evelyn wasn't silent at all. She was communicating, just not in the way Claire had expected. Evelyn's eyes never left Claire's, and in that stillness, the room seemed to shrink. Claire's skin crawled as she realized the truth. Evelyn wasn't mute. She had been speaking all along, through the shadows, through the whispers, through the cold air that surrounded them. Claire reached for the notepad on her desk, ready to ask Evelyn what she was trying to say. But before she could write a single word, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever before. This time they were all around her, inescapable. "It is you, Claire. You have brought us here. She is waiting." Claire's mind reeled as the whispers coiled around her, filling her head, drowning her in a cacophony of voices. She looked at Evelyn, but the woman's face was no longer just still. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. And then, as the room seemed to close in around her, Claire understood. Evelyn wasn't the patient. She wasn't the one in need of therapy. The therapist had been the one who was being studied, being watched all along. And now, it was Claire's turn to be silenced. The shadow beneath the bed. Martin had never been one to believe in the supernatural. A man of logic and reason, he approached life with a pragmatic mindset, shrugging off stories of ghosts and creatures lurking in the shadows. So when the scratching began, it took him weeks before he even considered the possibility that something could be wrong. It started as a faint noise, almost imperceptible, like a mouse scurrying beneath the floorboards. But Martin didn't have mice in his apartment, and the sound seemed to come from beneath his bed, a place that hadn't been disturbed in ages. At first, he dismissed it. Old houses creaked. The walls groaned. It was probably just the house settling. But as the days passed, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was as though something, or someone, was trying to claw its way out from underneath the bed. Martin would lie awake at night, listening to the sound, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. He tried to ignore it, tried to sleep through it, but the noise was relentless. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, he snapped. He was tired of the whispers, tired of the eerie scratching that kept him awake. He stood up from the couch and walked into his bedroom, determined to solve the mystery. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds. He kneeled beside the bed, staring into the inky blackness beneath it. There was nothing there. Nothing but the thick shadows that pooled beneath the wooden frame. Martin let out a sigh, a mixture of relief and irritation. He had worked himself up over nothing. The house was just old, and his mind had played tricks on him. With one last glance under the bed, he stood up and walked to the light switch. But as his hand reached for it, a cold gust of air brushed past his ankle. His heart skipped a beat. He froze, eyes darting back to the bed. The scratching had stopped, but something else had begun, the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as it grew louder, it seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "Martin! Martin!" the voice murmured, so soft and far away it almost sounded like a breeze. He spun around, his breath quickening. The room was empty. No one was there. The whispers continued, growing more distinct, becoming words, urging him, beckoning him toward the bed. "Come closer. Come closer. It's waiting for you." Fear crept up Martin's spine, a cold chill washing over him. He backed away from the bed, not sure if he was imagining it, but his instincts screamed at him to leave. His pulse raced as the whispers turned into soft, high-pitched giggles, like children playing just out of sight. Without thinking, Martin grabbed the corner of the bedspread and yanked it off, pulling the bed away from the wall. He knelt down again, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nothing, just a hollow space beneath the bed, dark and silent. But then, something moved. A shadow, too quick to catch with his eyes, darted across the floor beneath him. A chill, so intense it felt like ice in his veins, ran through him. Before he could react, something grabbed his ankle, a cold, skeletal hand, thin, clawed, and impossibly strong, wrapped around his leg, pulling him under. Martin's heart raced as he kicked, thrashing in a panic, but the grip was unyielding, dragging him closer to the darkness beneath the bed. He let out a strangled scream, but the force pulling him was too strong. He reached out, grasping for anything that might stop him, but it was no use. He was being swallowed by the dark void under the bed. His fingers brushed the floor, and just as quickly as it had begun, the world around him went black. When Martin awoke, he wasn't in his bed. The first thing he noticed was the silence, complete oppressive silence. His body was cold, his limbs stiff, as though he had been lying in this place for hours, maybe longer. Slowly, he opened his eyes, only to be met with an inky blackness that stretched infinitely in every direction. He sat up, his head spinning, and gasped in disbelief. There was no floor beneath him, no walls around him, nothing. He was floating in a vast, dark void. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, as though the darkness itself was alive. And then he saw them. Figures. Shapes. They stood at the edges of his vision, their forms shifting and wavering in the endless dark. At first they appeared as shadows, indistinct and hazy, but as they drew closer, their details became clearer. Their eyes were hollow, deep, empty sockets that seemed to swallow the light around them. Their faces were blurred, featureless, and their movements were slow, deliberate. Martin's breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, his limbs unresponsive, as if the darkness itself had numbed him. The figures began to circle him, drawing closer with every passing moment. He could hear them now, low murmurs, unintelligible whispers that echoed around him. The air was thick with their presence, oppressive and stifling. They reached for him, their skeletal hands stretching out from the shadows, their hollow eyes never leaving his face. "Welcome," one of the figures said, its voice a rasping whisper that sent chills down his spine. "Welcome to the place between worlds," another figure hissed, its voice barely audible, as though it were speaking from far away. Martin tried to speak, but no sound came from his mouth. He struggled against the suffocating darkness, his mind racing, but there was no escape. The figures closed in around him, their hollow eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. He tried to scream, but the words wouldn't form, as if his voice had been stolen by the shadows. Suddenly, one of the figures reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against his cheek. Martin recoiled, but the figure's grip was firm. The coldness of its touch seeped into his skin, spreading through his body like ice. "Please," Martin thought desperately, his mind racing, trying to grasp onto any shred of hope. "Let me go. I don't belong here." But the figure only smiled, if it could be called a smile. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, filled with jagged, broken teeth. "You belong to us now," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. And as the darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole, Martin realized with a sinking heart that he was no longer in the world he knew. He had crossed into something far worse, something ancient and terrifying. The shadow beneath the bed had claimed him, and there would be no escaping it. The last broadcast. The soft hum of the radio transmitter echoed through the darkened studio. Evan Miller adjusted his headphones, his fingers dancing across the mixing console as he prepared for another late-night shift. The studio, tucked away on the outskirts of town, was as much a refuge for Evan as it was his livelihood. It was the calm after the world's chaos, a place where voices and music replaced the harsh clamor of reality. He'd been a late-night radio host for years, broadcasting to an audience that stretched across the city and beyond. It was the perfect job for someone who preferred solitude, long hours in the quiet, talking to listeners who shared their stories under the veil of night. There was something soothing about the anonymity of it all, the voices fading in and out like ghosts in the dark. But tonight, something was different. As the clock struck midnight, the phone line buzzed. Evan reached for the receiver without thinking, familiar with the routine of taking calls during his show. He answered with his usual smooth tone, "You're listening to Midnight Shadows with Evan Miller." "Who's on the line?" There was a brief pause on the other end, a heavy breath. Then a voice, distorted, crackling, came through the speakers. Evan, I need your help." Evan sat up straighter in his chair, his eyebrows furrowing. The voice was strained, as though it was fighting against static, and there was an unmistakable edge of fear to it. "Of course, who's calling?" "My name's Ray Carter. I think I'm stuck in another world." The words hung in the air, absurd and unbelievable, and yet Evan felt a shiver run down his spine. He'd heard his fair share of odd calls, pranks, drunk dialers, the occasional conspiracy theorist, but this one was different. There was a rawness to the voice, an unsettling sense of urgency that made Evan's fingers tighten around the phone. "Ray, I'm not sure I follow. Another world?" "What do you mean?" Evan asked, trying to keep his voice steady, as if he were speaking to a caller like any other. There was another long pause, followed by the sound of rustling, like the phone was being moved around, or perhaps Ray was pacing. The static grew louder, then faded for a moment, only to return with greater intensity. It's hard to explain. I was driving, and then everything changed. The roads, the sky, everything's different here. I can't find anyone, and when I do, they're wrong. They look like people, but they're not. I don't know how I got here. Please, you have to help me." Evan's grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing. A prank, maybe? But there was something in Ray's voice, something that was too real to be a joke. "Ray, are you sure you're okay? Have you seen a doctor? This sounds like, I don't know, maybe you're just disoriented or—" No, you don't understand," Ray interrupted, his voice breaking. "I'm not crazy. There's something wrong here. I can hear the hum, like the world's buzzing. It's everywhere, all around me. And when I try to talk to people, they just stare at me. It's like they don't know I'm real. I don't know how to get back." Evan's pulse quickened. This wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a prank. Ray sounded desperate, unraveling with every word, and Evan could hear the faintest hint of static in the background, like the call was coming from a place just beyond the reach of the radio waves. It was unsettling, like a voice from the other side of a great, invisible divide. "Ray, I don't know how I can help, but I'll stay on the line. You just need to tell me where you are. Maybe I can send help," Evan said, trying to ground himself, trying to make sense of the situation. Ray's voice grew more frantic, the words coming faster now. "No one's going to come for me, Evan. They're all dead. They don't know they're dead. And the worst part, there's something here. Something in the dark. It's watching me. It's—" The voice cut off suddenly, replaced by a high-pitched screech the sound of a radio signal in distress. Evan yanked the phone away from his ear, grimacing. The static blared louder, disorienting, filling the entire studio. His stomach twisted, unease gnawing at him as he tried to recalibrate the dials. But nothing was working. The noise was overwhelming, like an unseen force was trying to tear through the airwaves. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the static ceased. Evan stared at the receiver in his hand, his heart hammering in his chest. Ray's voice was gone. Before he could gather his thoughts, another call came through. "Hello?" Evan's voice was tight, his words stumbling in his throat. Evan, it's me again." Ray's voice, now unmistakably clearer, crackled through the speakers. "You're still there?" Evan's breath caught. "Ray, what happened? Where are you?" Ray's voice was softer now, but something in it had changed. There was a distant, almost hollow quality to it, as though it were coming from a place far deeper than before. "I told you, Evan, I'm stuck. You have to listen carefully. You're in danger. You need to leave the studio." A chill ran down Evan's spine. "What are you talking about? What danger? I'm just sitting here. I'm talking to you, Ray. What's going on?" The voice on the other end of the line began to distort again, wavering and warping as though the very air between them was bending, stretching beyond its limits. No, you're not listening, Evan. I'm in the same place you are. The voice cut out again, leaving only the crackling hum of static, the sound growing louder and louder, filling the entire studio. Evan jumped to his feet, panic setting in. He slammed his hand against the controls, trying to stop the noise, but it only intensified. The room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the walls vibrating with an unnatural hum. He backed away from the console, his eyes darting around the darkened studio, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding around him. And then, just as the static reached a deafening crescendo, the voice returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the speakers, right in front of him. "I'm here, Evan," the voice said, too clear, too close, sending ice through his veins. "I'm here with you. I'm right next to you." Evan's heart stopped. He slowly turned, his gaze flickering toward the sound. And there, standing in the shadows at the back of the studio, was a figure. It was distorted, its outline fuzzy and indistinct, but it was there, watching him. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, hollow and empty, like the void itself had taken shape. "No," Evan whispered, his mind reeling. "No, this can't be happening." The figure took a step forward, its body warping and flickering with each movement. It was Ray, or at least it had been. The face, if it could still be called a face, was twisted, its features stretched in unnatural angles, like a reflection seen through cracked glass. "I'm trapped, Evan," the voice from the speaker echoed, now layered with an eerie, otherworldly distortion. "And now, you are too." The figure stepped closer, the hum of static growing louder, almost deafening. Evan took a step back, but his legs felt heavy, as though the floor beneath him had suddenly become quicksand. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the voice, no longer distorted, but as clear and real as his own breath. "You shouldn't have stayed on the line." Or the stranger who knew everything. It started on a Monday. Claire had always hated Mondays, but this one was different. This was the day a stranger walked into her life. Someone who knew things about her that no one else did. She had been at her usual cafe, tucked into the corner with her laptop open, half listening to the hum of conversation around her. The barista knew her order by heart. Black coffee, 1 sugar, no cream. Routine was comforting, predictable, safe. That's when he sat down across from her. She hadn't even noticed him approach, which was odd because she always paid attention to her surroundings. But there he was, as if he had always been there. At first, she thought he was just another customer who had taken the wrong seat. He was well-dressed, older, with sharp features and an unsettling stillness. His gaze was fixed on her, eyes dark, calculating. "Claire," he said. Her stomach clenched. She hadn't told him her name. She forced a polite smile. "Do I know you?" He tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. "Not yet." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, closing her laptop. "No," he said, leaning forward. "You had a dog when you were 9, a golden retriever named Toby. He got hit by a car and you cried for 3 days, but you told your parents you were fine because you didn't want them to feel guilty." The air left her lungs. There was no way he could know that. Her hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Who are you?" He ignored the question. "You still have the box of notes your high school boyfriend wrote you. You tell yourself you're going to throw them away, but you never do. You reread them sometimes when you feel alone." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She hadn't told anyone about that. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "Are you some kind of private investigator?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No." Claire's fingers twitched, every instinct screaming at her to leave. But something about the way he looked at her, as if he was waiting for something, held her in place. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," she said, "but you need to stop." He exhaled as if disappointed. "You always do this," he murmured. She frowned. "What?" But he just shook his head and stood. "Be careful, Claire." Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She sat frozen, the coffee in her cup growing cold. The next time she saw him, it was at her office. She worked in marketing, a quiet job where she could keep to herself. She had just stepped outside for some air when she spotted him across the street, standing perfectly still, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to go back inside, but something in her rebelled. If she let fear control her, she'd never feel safe again. So she crossed the street. He didn't move as she approached. "You need to stop following me," she said, keeping her voice firm. "I'm not following you," he replied. "I just wanted to see if you'd talk to me this time." Her skin prickled. "This time?" she repeated. He smiled. "You never remember." She took a step back. "Remember what?" But he just studied her, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't matter. Not yet." Her patience snapped. "Look, I don't know who you are, but if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to the police." His smile faded. "Claire, I'm not the one you should be afraid of." A chill ran through her. "Then who should I be afraid of?" she whispered. But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away. That night, she locked every door and window in her apartment. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. His words played over and over in her mind. "I'm not the one you should be afraid of." Then who was? She tried to sleep, but every sound made her flinch. She checked the locks 3 times. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? A man knows things about me he shouldn't? That wasn't a crime. By the time exhaustion overtook her, it was past 3 a.m. She woke to the sound of whispering. Her eyes snapped open, heart hammering. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then she heard it again. A low murmur coming from the other room. Her stomach twisted. Someone was in her apartment. Slowly, she reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked it, ready to call 911. Then the whispering stopped. Silence. Claire held her breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Forcing herself to move, she slid out of bed, heart pounding. The apartment was dark. Too dark. She crept toward the living room, every nerve on edge. The air felt wrong, like she wasn't alone. She reached the doorway and froze. The front door was wide open. A gust of cold night air drifted in. She hadn't left it open. She had locked it. Her throat went dry. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out. Then she saw it. A note, lying on the floor just inside the door. The neighbor's basement. Greg Patterson had always been the curious type. It wasn't that he intended to be nosy, but the human inclination to uncover the unknown always drew him in, even when it was best left undisturbed. So when he moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, it didn't take long for him to notice the oddities that surrounded his reclusive neighbor, Mr. Barron. Barron's house was unlike the others on the block. It stood in almost complete silence, with its overgrown yard and windows that never seemed to open. The old man who lived there was a mystery to everyone. He kept to himself, only leaving the house on rare occasions, always with a long coat and a hat pulled low over his face. His car, a rusting sedan, sat in the driveway for days on end, sometimes weeks. No one had seen any visitors, and rumors had started to circulate about what went on inside that house. Greg wasn't one to indulge in gossip, but the secrecy surrounding Mr. Barron had piqued his interest. One evening, as he sat on his front porch, he saw the old man enter the house, the door creaking loudly as it closed behind him. The curtains in the windows fluttered, briefly revealing a shadow moving through the dimly lit interior. That was the moment the idea took root. He would investigate. It started innocently enough. A few casual conversations with neighbors revealed nothing unusual. Mrs. Calloway, who lived next door to Barron, mentioned that the old man had lived there for decades and was well known for his eccentricities. But no one had ever been inside his house, no one except for him. One fateful night, after a long day of work, Greg found himself walking past Barron's house again. The lights were dim, and the street was eerily quiet. He glanced over at the tall, narrow windows that lined the house's side, and something caught his eye. There, in the basement window, a sliver of light flickered briefly. He had never seen light there before. Something stirred in Greg's chest. A strange feeling, a gut instinct, urged him to investigate further. He waited until the street was empty, the neighborhood quiet and peaceful, and then he made his move. The back gate creaked open as Greg slipped into the yard, his heart pounding with excitement and unease. The basement window was only a few feet off the ground, hidden by the thick vines and ivy that crawled up the stone walls. He knelt down, peering through the grime-covered glass, his breath fogging the window. What he saw chilled him. The basement was large, far bigger than he'd expected. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple storage area, filled with old furniture, crates, and boxes. But there was something in the far corner that made Greg's blood run cold. It was a large, rusted cage, and within it, there appeared to be movement. The shape inside was hunched, human, but not quite. The figure shifted, its arms twitching unnaturally, and Greg felt a wave of dread wash over him. He jerked back from the window, heart racing. That was it. That was the moment Greg knew he had to know more. He couldn't walk away now, not after seeing that. His curiosity burned brighter than ever. The next day, Greg returned under the cover of darkness. He knew the risk he was taking, but the thought of the creature, whatever it was, trapped in Barron's basement consumed him. He approached the back of the house once more, moving silently across the lawn. The moonlight provided just enough illumination to see the faint outline of the basement window. He crouched down again, his breath shallow as he peered inside, This time, the figure in the cage was more visible. It was human. At least, it had been at one point. The skin was gaunt, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones. The face was a grotesque mask, hollow eyes staring into nothingness. But the worst part was its movement, jerky, spasmodic, like it was in constant agony. Greg's stomach churned. He felt a cold sweat break out across his back. He had to find a way to get inside. There was no turning back now. Later that night, he returned, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar. He'd scouted out the basement entrance, a small door at the back of the house that led directly into the cellar. It was the perfect point of entry. The door creaked open with ease, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness. His heart hammered in his chest as he stepped into the damp, cold basement. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and as he shone the flashlight around, the beam revealed row upon row of old furniture and discarded items, just like he'd seen through the window. But there, in the far corner, was the cage, and the creature inside was staring at him. It was no longer just hunched over. It was standing now, its hands reaching toward the bars of the cage, fingers elongated and twisted. Its eyes, hollow and sunken, locked onto Greg's, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of the terror that had been lurking. Behind Barron's house, then a voice, quiet, rasping, almost a whisper, filled the air. "Help me," it begged, though the word was distorted and broken, as if the very sound of it caused pain. "Please, help." Greg's blood ran cold. He backed away, but his foot hit something, sending a loud crash through the room. The creature's head snapped around, its hollow eyes narrowing, its body jerking violently. It let out a guttural, inhuman scream, and Greg froze, realizing that it wasn't asking for help. It was warning him. Before he could react, the basement door slammed shut behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the house. His heart stopped. From the shadows, Mr. Barron appeared, his pale face emerging from the darkness. His eyes were wide and manic, his lips twisted into a thin smile. "You shouldn't have come here," Barron said, his voice low and menacing. Greg's pulse surged as he turned toward the door, but it was too late. Barron was blocking the only way out, his figure towering in the dim light. The old man's face was almost unrecognizable now, his skin stretched tight, eyes gleaming with a hunger that sent chills down Greg's spine. "You've seen too much," Barron continued, stepping closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Now you'll join them." Greg backed away, his mind racing for an escape. He turned the flashlight on Barron, the beam shaking in his hands. Barron's face twitched, a grimace crossing his features. The smile never left his lips. "You don't understand," Barron muttered. "They never understand. Fear is sustenance. I feed on it. And you, my friend, you've given me plenty." Greg scrambled toward the cage, the creature inside watching him with a mix of pity and terror. He could hear Barron moving closer, his footsteps slow but inevitable. Desperation clawed at him, and he reached for the bars, only to feel a cold, clammy hand grip his wrist. "Don't fight it," Barron whispered. "You belong to this place now." With a final, desperate cry, Greg tried to wrench himself free, but Barron's grip tightened, and the world around him seemed to blur. As the darkness closed in, Greg realized the horrifying truth. He hadn't discovered Barron's secret. He had become part of it. The next morning, the neighbors would talk about the strange noise coming from Barron's house. The police would be called, but when they arrived, there was no trace of Greg. Mr. Barron's house remained silent, its windows still and lifeless. And in the basement, a new face would join the others. Pale, hollow-eyed, and frozen in fear. Greg Patterson would never be seen again.